on a warm afternoon in May of 1912, the doors opened at a new hotel in the barren foothills northwest of Los Angeles. The building was pink Spanish colonial revival in style, surrounded by 12 acres of what would become manicured gardens but was then mostly scrubland and wild grass. The location seemed absurd. There was no city here, no neighborhood, no reason anyone would choose to stay in this isolated spot. The nearest significant development was miles away. The roads were unpaved. Getting here required determination or significant wealth, often both. Yet the investors believed they were building something that would define luxury for a new American elite, a place so exclusive that remoteness was not a liability but a feature. They called it the Beverly Hills Hotel. The man behind the hotel was Burton Green, though his role has been largely erased from popular memory. Green was a developer who had purchased the land that would become Beverly Hills in 1906 along with a group of investors. They had initially planned to drill for oil, convinced that the rancho land held petroleum deposits. When the oil proved sparse and economically unviable, Green pivoted to real estate development, subdividing the land and marketing it as an exclusive residential community for wealthy Analinos seeking escape from the city's growing pollution and density. The hotel was built not as a hospitality venture primarily, but as an advertisement, a centerpiece that would attract the kind of buyers who could afford the lots Green was selling. The construction of the hotel required labor that came from communities Green and his investors would never visit. Mexican workers, some whose families had lived in California for generations before it became American territory, built the pink palace that would symbolize a new California dream from which they would be excluded. They mixed the concrete, laid the bricks, installed the plumbing and electrical systems that would make the hotel functional. They planted the first palms and prepared the grounds. Their wages were a fraction of what white workers would have demanded, and their employment was temporary, ending the moment the hotel was ready to receive its first guests. There are no photographs of these workers in the hotel's official archives. Their contribution has been erased as thoroughly as the indigenous Tonfa people who had lived on this land for thousands of years before Spanish colonization. The hotel's first manager was Margaret Anderson, a detail that is rarely mentioned in the carefully constructed mythology. Anderson was a businesswoman in an era when women in such positions were anomalies. She managed the property with precision and understood that the hotel's success depended on creating an environment where wealthy guests felt both seen and protected from scrutiny. The hotel was small initially, 40 rooms, but each one was finished with imported materials and furnishings that suggested European sophistication. The Spanish architecture was deliberate, evoking California's romantic Spanish colonial past while erasing the actual history of Mexican land grants and indigenous displacement that made the property available for purchase in the first place. Anderson faced challenges that male managers would not have encountered. Guests sometimes refused to take direction from a woman. Suppliers attempted to overcharge, assuming she lacked business acumen. Staff members, particularly men who resented answering to female authority, tested her constantly. She navigated these obstacles through a combination of competence and strategic alliances with the investors who had hired her. Her tenure established operational standards that would define the hotel for decades, but her contributions were minimized in later histories, which preferred narratives centered on male visionaries and celebrity guests rather than the administrative skill that actually made the hotel function. The hotel struggled in its early years. World War I reduced travel. The remoteness that was supposed to signal exclusivity felt instead like isolation. Guests complained about the lack of amenities nearby, the difficulty of reaching the property, the strange quiet that settled over the grounds at night. The hotel operated at a loss through much of its first decade, sustained by investors who believed the surrounding real estate development would eventually make the property valuable. This patience was possible only because the investors had sufficient capital to absorb years of losses, a luxury that shaped the hotel's trajectory in ways that are rarely acknowledged. Had the hotel needed to be immediately profitable, the entire character of the property would have been different, the exclusivity diluted to attract a broader clientele. But something shifted in the early 1920s. The film industry, which had established itself in nearby Hollywood, began generating extraordinary wealth for a new class of Americans who did not fit into the social structures of the East Coast elite. Movie stars, studio executives, and producers needed places where they could be seen by the right people while avoiding unwanted attention. The Beverly Hills Hotel, with its privacy and proximity to the studios, became exactly that place. The transformation was not accidental. The hotel's management began cultivating relationships with studio publicists, offering favorable rates to stars whose presence would attract others, ensuring that photographers were present at the right moments to capture glamour, while being excluded when discretion was required. Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford stayed at the hotel and spoke favorably about it to their circle. Charlie Chaplin was photographed on the grounds. The hotel began appearing in gossip columns, not as a location so much as a symbol. To be at the Beverly Hills Hotel was to be part of something exclusive, something modern, something that represented the new American aristocracy of talent and money rather than lineage. The hotel's management understood this and began cultivating relationships with studio publicists, ensuring that the right people were seen at the right times while keeping scandals and indiscretions carefully contained. The staff who made this glamour possible came from a different Los Angeles entirely. Many were immigrants, Japanese gardeners, who maintained the grounds with precision that reflected traditions brought from their homeland. Filipino workers who had come to California seeking opportunities that proved limited and exploitive, Mexican maids and cooks whose labor was essential but whose presence was meant to be invisible. They arrived before dawn and left after dark, commuting from neighborhoods where housing was segregated by race and class. The distance between their homes and the hotel was not just geographical but experiential. They moved between two worlds that existed simultaneously in the same city but operated according to completely different rules. The wages paid to hotel workers in the 1920s were low even by the standards of the time. A maid might earn $15 per week for 6 days of work, 10 to 12 hours per day. This was barely enough to cover rent and food, with nothing left for savings or emergencies. Workers supplemented their income through tips when possible, but tips were unpredictable and often reflected the whims of guests rather than the quality of service. A worker could perform their duties perfectly and receive nothing, or could be tipped generously for reasons that had nothing to do with their work. This precarity was a feature of the system, not a flaw. It ensured workers remained grateful for employment and unlikely to demand better conditions. In 1927, the hotel was sold to a group of investors who expanded it significantly, adding wings and increasing capacity to more than 200 rooms. The expansion required another surge of construction labor, again drawn from communities that would never stay as guests. The workers who built the new wings worked without safety equipment that would become standard decades later. Falls from scaffolding were common. Injuries from tools and materials were expected. The hotel's management was not responsible for these injuries under the legal framework of the time. Workers bore the cost of their own medical care or simply worked through injuries they could not afford to treat. The expansion also added the Polo Lounge, which would become the hotel's most famous space, though not immediately. The lounge was designed as a place where industry executives could conduct business in an environment that felt social rather than transactional. Deals were made at tables over drinks. Careers were launched or destroyed in conversations that appeared casual but were carefully choreographed exercises in power. The staff at the Polo Lounge learned to be invisible while remembering everything, a skill that made them invaluable to guests who needed discretion. A good waiter in the Polo Lounge knew who was having affairs, who was negotiating contracts, who was in financial trouble, who was planning to fire whom. This knowledge was never used, never spoken of outside the property, never acknowledged, but it existed, and it gave the staff a kind of power that was real even if it could never be exercised. The naming of the Polo Lounge itself reveals the class aspirations of the hotel's clientele. Polo was a sport of the wealthy, associated with East Coast aristocracy and British nobility. Los Angeles in the 1920s had no significant polo culture, but the name communicated social position. It suggested that guests at the Beverly Hills Hotel were the kind of people who might play polo, or at least knew people who did. This aspirational naming was part of a broader strategy to position a hotel not as Western or Californian specifically, but as a place where American wealth could perform sophistication equivalent to European aristocracy. The 1930s brought the Depression, which affected the hotel less than might be expected. While unemployment devastated working-class communities in Los Angeles, the film industry continued generating wealth for those at the top. The hotel's clientele had contracted somewhat, but those who could still afford it were willing to pay premium prices for the isolation and service the property offered. The hotel became known for maintaining staff through the Depression years, a fact presented as generosity but which also ensured institutional knowledge remained. The workers who cleaned rooms, served drinks, and maintained the grounds knew the private lives of some of the most famous people in America. Their silence was purchased with steady employment in an era when jobs were scarce. But steady employment did not mean fair employment. The hotel took advantage of Depression-era desperation to suppress wages even further. Workers accepted conditions they might have rejected in better economic times because the alternative was unemployment and destitution. The hotel's management understood this leverage and used it. Complaints about working conditions or requests for raises were met with the implicit threat of dismissal. The abundance of desperate workers meant anyone could be replaced immediately. This dynamic created a workforce that was skilled and experienced, but also fearful and exploited. The hotel's physical appearance became iconic during this period. The pink stucco exterior, the green awnings, the palms planted in careful arrangements, all of it created an aesthetic that communicated a very specific idea of California luxury. It was not ostentatious in the way of European grand hotels. It was relaxed, sun-soaked, informal in presentation while being rigidly controlled in practice. Photographs of the hotel began circulating in magazines and newspapers, always shot to emphasize the lush grounds and Spanish architecture, while carefully framing out the surrounding development, which was growing rapidly as Beverly Hills transformed from isolated subdivision to established wealthy enclave. The carefully composed photographs never showed the staff quarters, which were cramped and minimally maintained. They never showed the service areas where workers ate hurried meals between shifts. They never showed the time clocks where workers punched in and out under the supervision of managers who tracked every minute to ensure no one was paid for time not actively working. The invisible infrastructure that made the hotel function was kept carefully out of frame, preserving the illusion that luxury simply existed rather than being produced through exploitation. The outbreak of World War II brought changes that disrupted the hotel's carefully maintained stability. Many of the male staff were drafted or enlisted. The management hired women and older men to replace them, training them quickly and paying them less than their predecessors. The justification was that the work was temporary, filling in until the men returned, so lower wages were appropriate. But the productivity expected from these replacement workers was identical to what had been demanded of those they replaced. The hotel operated at the same level of service while its labor costs decreased, a windfall that ownership pocketed rather than sharing with workers. Wartime rationing affected the hotel's ability to provide certain luxuries, but the clientele adapted. The hotel remained open throughout the war, serving as a place where defense contractors, studio executives managing wartime propaganda production, and military officers on leave could meet and conduct business. The bar filled with uniforms and the conversation shifted to contracts and logistics, but the fundamental nature of the hotel, as a place where power was exercised in informal settings, remained unchanged. The war was profitable for some, and those profits were discussed and distributed in booze at the Polo Lounge, while workers served drinks and pretended not to hear. After the war, the hotel entered what would later be remembered as its golden age, though the nostalgia that surrounds this period obscures more than it reveals. Elizabeth Taylor celebrated one of her many honeymoons at the hotel. Howard Hughes rented bungalows for years, conducting his increasingly erratic business from the privacy of the grounds. The pool became a site where starlets were photographed in carefully arranged candid shots that launched careers or sustained fading ones. But behind these carefully curated images was a machine of control and exploitation that the hotel's management ran with precision. The staff, predominantly Mexican and Central American immigrants by the 1950s, worked long hours for wages that barely supported their families. They commuted from East Los Angeles and other working-class neighborhoods, traveling hours to reach a workplace that symbolized everything they could never afford. They made beds that cost more per night than they earned in a week. They served drinks to people who did not acknowledge their existence except to complain when service was not sufficiently invisible. The tips could be generous or insulting, depending on the whim of guests who saw the workers as part of the scenery rather than as people with lives and struggles beyond the hotel grounds. The commute itself was a daily reminder of inequality. Workers rose before dawn to catch multiple buses, traveling from neighborhoods where housing was affordable but infrastructure was neglected, to Beverly Hills, where every street was maintained perfectly and every service was readily available. The journey could take 2 hours each way. Workers spent a quarter of their day simply getting to and from a job that paid them barely enough to survive. This time was uncompensated. The hotel paid only for hours worked on the property. The time spent traveling, the physical and mental exhaustion of the commute, was the workers' problem to solve. The hotel's management structure was hierarchical and rigid. Department heads, almost exclusively white men, controlled hiring and firing with little oversight. Workers who questioned conditions or attempted to organize were dismissed and blacklisted from other luxury hotels in the area. The system functioned because the supply of desperate workers exceeded demand for positions, and because the hotel's reputation made employment there something that could be highlighted on a resume, even if the reality of the work was grinding and demeaning. Workers endured exploitation because the alternative was worse, and because the prestige of working at the Beverly Hills Hotel might eventually lead to opportunities at other establishments where conditions were marginally better. In 1954, the hotel was sold again, this time to Ben Silberstein, a Detroit real estate investor who had made his fortune developing shopping centers. Silberstein purchased the hotel through a company called the Hernando Courtright Corporation, named after the man he hired to manage the property. Courtright was a hotelier who understood that the Beverly Hills Hotel's value was not in its rooms or amenities, which were good but not exceptional, but in its social currency. Under his management, the hotel became even more exclusive, with policies that restricted who could enter certain spaces based on status and connections rather than ability to pay. Courtright implemented a system of social gatekeeping that was subtle but effective. The reservations desk was trained to recognize names and make judgments about who belonged. Someone calling to book a room would be quoted one price if their name suggested old money or industry connections, and a higher price if they seemed like tourists or outsiders. The explanation would be about availability or seasonal rates, but the real calculation was about maintaining the hotel's character. This discrimination was legal at the time and widely practiced, but it reveals how luxury was not just about money but about membership in a class that recognized itself through signals the uninitiated could not perceive. The racial dynamics of mid-century America were fully present at the Beverly Hills Hotel, though they were performed with California smoothness rather than Southern bluntness. Black guests were rare and, when they did appear, were often subjected to subtle exclusions. Sammy Davis Jr. stayed at the hotel but was not allowed to swim in the pool during peak hours. Lena Horne was welcomed as a performer but faced restrictions on where she could socialize. The hotel's management did not need explicit discriminatory policies when social pressure and staff discretion could achieve the same segregation without legal liability. A black guest might be told the pool was closed for maintenance, or that the Polo Lounge was fully booked, or simply made to feel unwelcome through cold service and hostile glances from other guests. These practices were justified through euphemism. The hotel was protecting its character, maintaining standards, ensuring guest comfort, but the reality was straightforward racial discrimination, operating under the cover of private property rights and business judgment. The staff, many of whom were people of color themselves, were forced to participate in this system, refusing service to black guests while serving white ones. The psychological cost of this complicity was never acknowledged or addressed. Workers who objected could be fired. Workers who complied carried the moral weight of their actions. There was no good option, only survival. The bungalows, which had been added to the property in the 1940s, became the hotel's most sought-after accommodations. Numbered rather than named, they offered privacy that even the best suites in the main building could not match. Studio heads rented them for months, using them as offices, trysting spots, or simply as refuges from the public eye. The most famous bungalow, number 5, became known as a place where deals were made and careers decided. Access to the bungalows was controlled carefully, with management deciding who was offered the opportunity to rent them based on social and professional status rather than simple financial capacity. The bungalows were serviced by dedicated staff who signed confidentiality agreements, though these agreements were informal and unenforceable. The real enforcement came through the understanding that discretion was the price of continued employment. A worker who revealed what they saw in the bungalows would never work in luxury hospitality again. This created a system where the powerful could behave without fear of exposure, knowing that the people who witnessed their actions had more to lose from speaking than from remaining silent. Affairs, drug use, violent arguments, financial crimes, all of it was observed and forgotten by workers who understood that their survival depended on selective memory. The 1960s brought cultural changes that the hotel navigated carefully. The counterculture movement was happening blocks away on the Sunset Strip, but within the walls of the Beverly Hills Hotel, the aesthetic remained frozen in the previous era. Long hair and casual dress were discouraged. The clientele skewed older and more conservative. The hotel became a refuge for an establishment that felt under siege from social changes it did not understand or approve. This positioning was strategic. As other hotels attempted to modernize and attract younger clientele, the Beverly Hills Hotel doubled down on traditional luxury and exclusivity, betting that there would always be wealthy people who wanted to be insulated from cultural transformation. The Polo Lounge became even more central to the hotel's identity during this period. It was here that agents negotiated contracts, that affairs began and ended, that friendships were formed and betrayed. The social architecture of the lounge was complex. Certain booths were understood to be more prestigious than others. Being seated at the wrong table could signal falling status. The maitre d' wielded enormous power, deciding placement in ways that communicated hierarchies the guests understood intuitively. New arrivals to Los Angeles, no matter how wealthy or successful in other contexts, had to navigate these unwritten rules or risk marking themselves as outsiders. The workers in the Polo Lounge developed expertise in reading social dynamics. They knew which guests could be seated together and which needed to be kept apart. They knew whose drink needed to be refreshed immediately and who could be made to wait as a subtle assertion of their declining importance. This knowledge was acquired through years of observation and passed down through informal mentorship from senior staff to newer hires. It was valuable knowledge, but it belonged to the hotel, not to the workers who possessed it. If a worker left, their expertise left with them, and they could not monetize it elsewhere. The hotel captured all the value their learning created. In 1979, the hotel was sold to Marvin Davis, an oil tycoon from Colorado, who had recently entered the entertainment industry by purchasing 20th Century Fox. Davis saw the hotel as both an investment and a social tool, a place where he could host and influence the people who ran Hollywood. Under his ownership, the hotel underwent renovations that updated mechanical systems and refreshed decor while carefully preserving the aesthetic that had made it iconic. The pink remained pink. The green awnings stayed green. The illusion of timelessness was maintained even as everything underneath was being replaced or upgraded. The renovations displaced workers temporarily, and many were not rehired when the hotel reopened. The official explanation was that the renovations had reduced the number of staff positions needed, but the reality was that Davis wanted to break continuity with the previous ownership. Long-term employees who remembered how things had been done under previous management were liabilities. They might resist changes or compare current conditions unfavorably to the past. Newer workers, grateful for employment and lacking institutional knowledge, were easier to control. The turnover was presented as natural evolution, but it was a deliberate strategy to consolidate power and eliminate potential sources of resistance. The 1980s brought a new kind of wealth to Los Angeles: real estate speculation, financial deregulation, and the expansion of the entertainment industry created fortunes that made earlier generations of hotel guests look modest by comparison. The Beverly Hills Hotel's room rates increased accordingly. A standard room that might have cost $50 per night in the 1960s now cost $500. The increase was justified through references to renovations and rising costs, but the actual cost of operating the hotel had not risen proportionally. The difference was profit flowing to ownership while workers' wages remained stagnant. The clientele shifted slightly, incorporating more international visitors, particularly from the Middle East and Asia, who were buying properties in Beverly Hills and wanted accommodations that matched their expectations of luxury. The hotel adapted, hiring multilingual staff and adjusting service to accommodate different cultural expectations around privacy and deference. This adaptation required workers to learn new languages and customs, expanding their skills without corresponding increases in compensation. The hotel benefited from their increased capabilities while treating their labor as infinitely elastic, always demanding more without offering more in return. But the fundamental structure remained unchanged. The hotel was still a place where power was performed and exercised, where access was controlled, where the staff remained invisible except when needed, where wealth purchased not just comfort but insulation from the ordinary world. The workers who made this possible were still commuting from neighborhoods the guests never saw, still working long hours for wages that had not kept pace with the hotel's increasing revenues, still subject to management decisions that could end their employment without meaningful recourse. In 1987, Marvin Davis sold the hotel to the Sultan of Brunei for a reported $185 million, a price that seemed astronomical at the time but would prove to be a bargain. The sale marked a shift in who controlled luxury hospitality in America, from domestic businessmen to foreign sovereign wealth. The Sultan rarely visited the property but maintained it as both an investment and a symbol. The hotel continued operating much as it had, with management that understood their role was to preserve the institution while extracting maximum revenue. The Sultan's ownership brought new controversies in the 21st century. In 2014, Brunei implemented strict Sharia law, including criminal penalties for homosexuality and adultery, that sparked international condemnation. Activists called for boycotts of businesses owned by the Sultan, including the Beverly Hills Hotel. The hotel found itself at the center of debates about complicity and moral responsibility in luxury consumption. Some celebrities and industry figures publicly refused to attend events at the property. Others continued their patronage, arguing that boycotts would harm workers rather than ownership. The boycott movement revealed the hotel's vulnerability. For all its carefully cultivated prestige, it was ultimately a business dependent on reputation. When that reputation became associated with human rights abuses, even indirect association through ownership, the carefully constructed illusion of apolitical luxury crumbled. The hotel's management attempted to distance the property from the Sultan's policies, emphasizing that the hotel was an American business with American workers and management. But the ownership structure made this separation impossible to fully articulate. The staff navigated the boycott period with the same discretion they applied to all aspects of their work. They could not publicly support the boycott without risking their jobs, but many privately sympathized with its aims. The cognitive dissonance of serving wealthy guests in a building owned by someone implementing policies they found abhorrent was not new. The staff had always worked in an environment where their labor enabled luxury they could never access, where they were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to serve people who did not see them as fully human. The boycott simply made the moral complexity more visible. The hotel today operates much as it always has. The rooms have been updated with modern amenities. A spa was added. The pool area was redesigned. But the essential experience remains unchanged. Guests arrive and are insulated from anything that might intrude on their comfort. The staff moves through the property with practiced invisibility. The Polo Lounge still fills with people making deals and performing status. The bungalows are still rented by those who can afford them and whom management deems worthy of access. The hotel's archives are carefully controlled. Access is granted rarely and selectively. The official history emphasizes glamour and celebrity, while omitting labor disputes, discriminatory practices, and the various ways the property served as infrastructure for power rather than simple hospitality. The workers who spent careers at the hotel, who know its secrets and witnessed its private moments, are not invited to contribute to this official history. Their perspectives, which would complicate the carefully maintained narrative, are not considered relevant to the brand. The neighborhood around the hotel has changed dramatically since 1912. Beverly Hills became one of the wealthiest cities in America, with property values that exclude all but the extremely rich. The workers who maintain the hotel cannot afford to live anywhere near their workplace. They commute from increasingly distant locations as gentrification pushes working-class communities further from job centers. The geography of inequality is written into their daily lives, the distance between where they work and where they can afford to live growing longer each year. This is the story the hotel does not tell about itself. It is the story of how luxury is produced through invisible labor, how exclusivity functions to reinforce hierarchies, how institutions preserve power by controlling narrative. The Beverly Hills Hotel is beautiful, iconic, historically significant. It is also a monument to inequality, a space where the distance between those who serve and those who are served is absolute and carefully maintained. If you found value in this examination of how American luxury institutions function, how they serve power while obscuring it, I'd appreciate your support through a like. And if there's another institution whose carefully maintained mythology deserves scrutiny, let me know in the comments. These stories matter because they reveal how inequality is not an accident but an achievement, carefully constructed and maintained.